Imagine walking through your own mall, thinking everything's running smoothly, when suddenly, you hear a voice accusing a black teen of stealing. But what happens next will leave you speechless. What if the truth is far more shocking than anyone ever expected? Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. Malik had never expected his simple trip to the mall to turn into a nightmare. At 17, he had enough on his mind, preparing for the big college entrance exams. Trying to balance school with his part-time job, and staying on top of his responsibilities at home. All he wanted was to pick up a few things for the upcoming test and get out of the crowded mall. Yet, there he was, standing in front of a security guard in a small, dimly lit office, his heart pounding, trying to make sense of the situation that had turned his day upside down. It started when Malik had been browsing the aisles of the electronics store, trying to find the perfect calculator for his exam. He had no intention of stealing, not even for a second. His hands were occupied with sorting through the small, neatly stacked boxes when the security guard, a burly man with a scowl on his face, approached him. Without any warning, the guard grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the back of the store. "Hey, what's going on?" Malik had asked, trying to remain calm as the guard's grip tightened. "You're coming with me," the guard said, his voice low and threatening. Malik was too shocked to say anything else. He didn't understand. He hadn't stolen anything. Once inside the security office, things only got worse. The guard accused him of taking a phone case, though he had no proof. Malik tried to explain himself, but the words barely left his mouth before the guard cut him off. His eyes narrow with suspicion. "No one leaves without me checking," the guard muttered, moving toward the camera. "We'll see what the footage says." Malik stood there, confused and scared. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong. Yet the tension in the room was suffocating. He could feel the stares of the employees outside the office, their whispers laced with judgment. His heart raced as he thought about the implications. Was this really happening? Was this how people saw him because of the color of his skin? As Malik's mind raced, trying to find a way to clear his name, a sudden voice cut through the room. The door to the office swung open, and there stood Jessica Reed, the CEO of the mall's parent company. Malik had seen her on the news before, always poised, always in control, but now, her expression was one of genuine concern. "What's going on here?" Jessica asked, her eyes scanning the room. She was clearly surprised by the situation, her voice calm yet firm. She turned to Malik, offering him a reassuring smile before turning to the guard. "Is there a problem?" Malik felt a sense of relief at her sudden appearance. Maybe, just maybe, someone in charge would listen to him. The guard, still defensive, explained his accusations, but Jessica wasn't having it. She looked at the guard and then at Malik. She knew there had to be more to this than met the eye. Without wasting any time, she motioned to the guard. "I want to see the security footage," Jessica said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Now, the guard hesitated, but Jessica's authority was unmistakable. He quickly pulled up the video feed, and Malik could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him as the footage rolled. Jessica's gaze shifted between the screen and Malik. The tension in the room grew heavier, and for a moment, Malik thought his heart would stop. But then, as the footage continued, Jessica's expression softened. It was clear. There was no evidence of Malik stealing anything. She turned back to the guard, her voice colder than before. "You're making a mistake," she said, her eyes never leaving him. "And I don't tolerate mistakes like this. Malik, you're free to go." But the guard wasn't finished. He mumbled something under his breath, clearly annoyed, but Jessica wasn't about to let him off the hook. She turned her attention back to the matter at hand. "I'll be looking into this," she said firmly. "This won't happen again." Malik nodded, grateful for her intervention but still shaken. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a mistake, it was about something deeper. Something about the way he was perceived simply because of who he was. As Malik left the office, Jessica called after him. "Wait a moment." He turned around, confused but willing to listen. "I'll make sure this never happens again," Jessica assured him, her voice gentle but resolute. Thank you for your patience." He didn't know what else to say. He just nodded and walked out. The weight in his chest slightly lifted but still heavy. He knew Jessica had done her part. But there was still something unsettling about the whole ordeal. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about the larger systems in place. And Malik knew, deep down, that he would never forget this moment. He would fight to make sure this didn't happen again, not just for him, but for others who faced the same unfair treatment. Jessica Reed walked through the bustling mall with a sense of determination. The sharp click of her heels against the tiled floor echoed in the large, open space. She wasn't here to shop, nor to enjoy the usual hustle and bustle. She was here because something didn't sit right with her, and she needed to get to the bottom of it. The news of Malik's situation had made its way to her, and now, she couldn't ignore it. As she approached the security office, Jessica could already feel the tension in the air. Employees who had been minding their own business suddenly grew quiet, exchanging nervous glances. Malik, still sitting uncomfortably on a plastic chair, looked up at her with a flicker of hope in his eyes. She nodded toward him, signaling that she would handle this. Without hesitation, Jessica turned to the security guard, his name badge reading Gregory, who had been involved in the accusations. His broad shoulders stiffened as soon as he saw her. He had been standing tall moments earlier, his confidence unwavering, but now he looked like a deer caught in headlights. "I need to see the footage from the security cameras," Jessica said firmly, her eyes never leaving Gregory. "We're going to get to the bottom of this." Gregory hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly led Jessica to the monitor, where the footage was already playing. The room was thick with the weight of what was about to unfold. Jessica's fingers tapped rhythmically against her arm as she watched the screen, waiting for the moment that would confirm whether Malik was truly guilty or just another victim of an unfair system. The footage revealed Malik moving through the store, his hands never straying near anything he didn't pay for. He was clearly just another customer browsing, checking labels, and trying to decide which calculator to buy. No sudden movements, no furtive glances. Just an innocent young man caught up in a moment of confusion. Jessica felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she kept her composure. She turned to the guard, her voice cold and precise. "This is the video you based your accusation on?" she asked. Though she already knew the answer, Gregory's expression faltered. "Well, he was acting suspicious." "Suspicious?" Jessica cut him off. What exactly was suspicious about a teenager shopping for his future? A future, by the way, that you've just tried to ruin over a baseless accusation. She turned to the room, where the other employees had gathered. They all stood silently, eyes down, unwilling to speak up. It was clear that Gregory was not alone in his silence. This wasn't just a case of one bad apple. This was a culture of fear, where no one dared to question authority. No one dared to speak out against the status quo. Malik, meanwhile, sat back in his chair, the weight of his earlier anxiety still evident in the way his hands gripped the edge of the seat. He felt both a sense of relief that Jessica was taking charge, but also fear of what might happen next. Would the CEO's intervention really clear his name? Or would it just be another attempt to sweep the problem under the rug? His heart pounded in his chest, uncertainty gnawing at him. Gregory's eyes darted to the other employees, then back to Jessica. I didn't mean to accuse him without cause. But he seemed off." "Seemed off?" Jessica echoed, her voice rising with disbelief. "You don't accuse someone of theft because they seem off. This is about more than just you making an assumption. This is about how people are treated. How Malik is treated." Gregory shifted uncomfortably, his hands clenching at his sides. He was trying to explain himself, but it was clear that his words were faltering under the weight of Jessica's scrutiny. I just thought he looked suspicious. But I didn't know." Jessica wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. She demanded, "And where was your proof? Why didn't you take a moment to check the cameras before jumping to conclusions?" The silence in the room deepened. One by one, the employees lowered their heads, unable to make eye contact. Jessica stepped closer to Malik, her gaze softening as she turned back to him. "You're free to go," she said, her voice calm but filled with conviction. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Malik's eyes widened with gratitude, but also with confusion. He stood up, his legs slightly trembling as he walked toward the door. He glanced back at Jessica, still processing the weight of everything that had just happened. As he stepped out into the mall's open area, he felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. But at the same time, a deep-seated frustration lingered. This incident, no matter how much Jessica had helped, was a stark reminder of how easily people like him could be misjudged. It wasn't just about his experience in the mall, it was about something much larger. Something ingrained in the way society viewed people like him. He wasn't naive enough to think that his experience was an isolated one. Jessica turned back to Gregory, her expression hardening once again. This is far from over. I'll be reviewing all your security protocols and your conduct moving forward. This company will not tolerate discrimination of any kind. Understand? Gregory nodded, the fight gone from him. He knew Jessica wasn't bluffing. Jessica took a deep breath and walked out of the office, her mind already turning to the next steps. This situation wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was a sign of a much deeper issue that needed to be addressed. Jessica knew she couldn't stop at just clearing Malik's name. There was more to this story, something that had to be dug deeper. The uneasy feeling in her gut told her that the situation was bigger than one rogue security guard. She needed to understand the full picture. And to do that, she had to look beyond the surface. The following morning, she arrived at the mall early, her determination as sharp as ever. She immediately instructed the security team to pull all the footage from the cameras. Not just from the electronics store, but from every camera in the mall that could give a clearer picture of Malik's movements. She needed to know exactly what had happened. As the footage began to roll, Jessica watched carefully. It became painfully clear that Malik hadn't done anything wrong. There were no shady movements, no stashes of stolen goods, just a young man browsing like any other customer. His movements were deliberate, calm, and completely innocent. He seemed to be in a hurry. Yes, but that was understandable. He was preparing for an important exam. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Gregory, the security guard who had initially made the accusation, tried to defend himself. I was just doing my job, he muttered, his voice unsure. He seemed suspicious, and that's what I had to go on. Jessica turned to him, frustration tightening her jaw. Suspicion is not grounds for accusation, she said, her voice firm. You had no proof, and yet you accused him. You failed to follow protocol. And now I have to clean up your mess. Gregory's face flushed red, and for a brief moment, Jessica thought he might argue back. But he didn't. He just stood there, looking defeated, unsure of how to handle the situation now that the truth was out in the open. Jessica turned away from him, her eyes scanning the rest of the security staff. It was clear they were uncomfortable with her questioning, and many of them avoided eye contact, no doubt worried about their own roles in this mess. Jessica's mind was racing. There was still something off about this whole situation. She wasn't convinced that Gregory's mistake was just that, a mistake. Something else had to be going on. Get everyone who was involved in this incident in my office, she ordered. Now. The staff shuffled nervously, no one eager to be in the hot seat. Soon, the room was filled with the murmurs of employees reluctantly gathering in front of her. Jessica didn't waste time. I want full transparency. We are not leaving this room until I have all the facts, she said, looking each of them in the eye. If you know anything, you better speak up now. The silence was deafening. Everyone stood still, eyes down, clearly uncomfortable with being called to account. But Jessica wasn't going to let them off the hook. She needed to know everything. Why Malik had been singled out. Why no one had intervened. And why Gregory had acted with such certainty when the evidence was clearly against him. Then Emily, a young woman who worked in the store Malik had visited, spoke up. I've seen him do it before. Emily confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Gregory, I mean, he's always had a problem with certain customers. She paused, glancing at the other employees nervously. But no one ever said anything. We're all just too scared. Jessica turned toward her, her eyes narrowing as she processed Emily's words. What do you mean? Too scared, she pressed. Emily hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but she knew it was time to speak up. He's got some sway around here. He's always been the one calling the shots with security. If someone speaks up, they risk getting pushed out of their jobs. It's just how things are. Jessica felt a wave of anger rise within her. This wasn't just about Gregory's actions, it was about a systemic failure within the company. A culture that fostered fear and allowed employees to behave unprofessionally with no consequence. You're telling me that you've all been afraid to speak out because of one person? Jessica's voice rose with disbelief. That ends now. But as she said those words, a nagging suspicion in the back of her mind grew stronger. She wasn't going to let this go just yet. She needed to know why Gregory had been so sure of Malik's guilt. Even when there was no evidence, something didn't add up. She returned to the footage, rewinding and replaying the hours of security tapes. As the minutes ticked by, a subtle detail caught her eye. A figure appeared, moving swiftly in and out of the frame. It wasn't Malik, but a shadowy figure she hadn't noticed before. As the video continued, Jessica saw it, a store employee. A woman who had been standing at the counter nearby slipped something from the display rack into Malik's bag when his back was turned. The employee had deliberately planted the item, making it look like Malik had stolen it. Jessica froze, her breath catching in her throat. The twist was undeniable. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a setup. Her pulse quickened. She felt the weight of the discovery. Knowing this was no random act, someone had intentionally framed Malik. But why? And who was behind it? As she looked back at the employees in her office, her eyes now narrowed with suspicion. Jessica knew the real fight had only just begun. It wasn't just about clearing Malik's name anymore, it was about uncovering the conspiracy that had led to this. Someone had orchestrated it, and Jessica was determined to find out who. No matter where the investigation led. The tension in the conference room was palpable as Jessica gathered everyone involved in the incident. The entire security team, the store employees, and even Malik were summoned to the meeting. Jessica had made it clear, there would be no hiding. No sweeping things under the rug this time. She was determined to get to the bottom of what had happened and hold everyone accountable for their actions. The room was filled with uneasy whispers. The kind of murmur you get when everyone knows they've done something wrong. But no one wants to admit it. Jessica stood at the head of the table, her back straight and her gaze steady. She wasn't here to make friends, she was here to fix the damage. No matter how uncomfortable it made everyone else. Listen, I'm not here to point fingers or make anyone feel uncomfortable. She began, her voice calm but firm. But we need to understand exactly what happened with Malik, and we need to do it now. Everyone here is a part of this, and we will find the truth. She paused for a moment, allowing her words to sink in. She could see some of the employees fidgeting in their seats, looking anywhere but at her. The security guard, Gregory, was sitting at the far end of the room, his face flushed with embarrassment. Gregory, she said, turning her attention toward him. I want to start with the footage. We'll see what happened and how we ended up here. With a nod from Jessica, the lights dimmed, and the video footage from the security cameras started to play on the large screen at the front of the room. Malik was clearly visible, moving through the store, picking up items, inspecting labels, and doing what any customer might do. But as the video continued, a familiar scene unfolded, the same scene that had played out when Malik was accused. Jessica's heart sank as the video revealed the full story. The footage showed a figure, one of the store employees, slipping a phone case into Malik's bag while his attention was elsewhere. The video had captured every detail. Clear as day, Jessica's eyes flicked from the screen to the room, watching as the uncomfortable realization spread across the faces of the employees. One by one, the room grew tense. Employees shifted in their seats, some looking down, others avoiding eye contact. The silence was deafening, and Jessica could feel the weight of the truth settling in. This wasn't just one person's mistake, it was a deeper problem that had festered within the store's culture. Gregory, still sitting at the edge of the room, shifted nervously in his chair. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice faltered as he looked at the footage. His once confident demeanor had shattered in an instant, and he knew, deep down, that there was no way to talk his way out of it. I was just doing my job, Gregory stammered. I thought Jessica held up her hand, silencing him. No, you didn't do your job. You made a hasty decision based on nothing but assumptions. You've just jeopardized an innocent man's future. How do you explain this footage? She motioned toward the screen, where the video showed the employee placing the stolen item in Malik's bag. Gregory looked at the ground. His face pale. He couldn't meet anyone's gaze. I didn't see it," he said weakly, his voice cracking. "I was just trying to do my job. I thought he looked suspicious." "Suspicion isn't enough," Jessica snapped. "You accuse someone of theft only when there is evidence. Not because they look suspicious. You failed to do your job properly. And now we're here." The room was still. No one said a word. Even the employees who had witnessed the event seemed too scared to speak up. The tension was suffocating, and the air was thick with the weight of what was being exposed. Jessica turned to the other employees. "This isn't just about Gregory. This is about the culture here. About how we treat each other. And how we treat our customers." She paused for a moment, letting her words linger. "You all knew something wasn't right. But none of you said anything. Why?" There was a long, uncomfortable silence before Emily, one of the store clerks, spoke up. "I saw him do it before," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Gregory, I mean, he's always had it out for certain customers. But no one ever says anything. We're all too afraid." Jessica's eyes softened as she turned to Emily. "Afraid of what?" Emily's voice trembled as she explained. "If we speak up, if we challenge him, we could lose our jobs. He's been here for years. He has influence, and no one wants to get on his bad side." Jessica felt a surge of anger. It wasn't just Gregory's fault. This was bigger than him. This was a system, a culture of fear that had allowed one person's actions to go unchecked for far too long. She knew that if she didn't act now, things would never change. "Enough," Jessica said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "This ends today. We're going to hold everyone accountable." But just as she thought the situation couldn't get any worse, a twist unfolded that no one saw coming. As the footage continued, Jessica noticed something more, a crucial detail that had slipped past her during the initial review. A different employee, standing near the counter, had quietly dropped the stolen item into Malik's bag while he was distracted by another customer. This was no accident. Someone had deliberately planted the item in his bag, knowing full well that it would be used to accuse him. Jessica's blood ran cold as the realization hit. This wasn't just a case of poor judgment, this was an intentional setup. The pieces were falling into place, and it became clear that Malik had been targeted. She turned back to the room, her voice steady but filled with resolve. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a deliberate attempt to frame Malik. She looked at the employees with a sharp gaze. "And we're going to find out who was behind it." Gregory's face turned an even darker shade of red as the truth settled over him like a weight. He knew, as did everyone in the room, that Jessica wasn't going to let this slide. "I will not tolerate this kind of behavior in my company," Jessica said, her voice unwavering. "Anyone involved in this must step forward now. If you don't, you will be dealt with accordingly." The room was silent, the weight of Jessica's words heavy in the air. It was no longer about just Malik. It was about cleaning up a mess that had been years in the making. And Jessica was ready to take it on, no matter what it took. The meeting had left a lingering sense of discomfort in Jessica's mind. While Malik's situation was finally addressed, something told her that this wasn't an isolated incident. As the CEO of the mall's parent company, Jessica had a responsibility to ensure fairness and transparency in all aspects of the business. She wasn't convinced that the problem was merely one bad apple. No, this went deeper, and she was determined to find out exactly what was going on behind the scenes. After the meeting, Jessica took immediate action. She called for a full review of the company's hiring and training practices. It was clear that Malik's case was part of a larger pattern of issues within the system. But what kind of pattern? Jessica had to dig deeper. She reached out to different departments across the mall, security, management, to gather all the necessary information. Her mind was focused on understanding the root of the problem. Was it a failure in recruitment? Were employees not being adequately trained? Or was there something more insidious at play? As she pored over the reports, one thing became glaringly clear. Employees were often turning a blind eye to customer complaints, especially if those complaints came from lower income or minority customers. There was a disturbing trend: favoritism for high-spending customers. Those who spent the most money were given preferential treatment, and lesser-paying customers were often overlooked, or worse, dismissed. This culture of treating people differently based on their economic status wasn't just a few rogue actions here and there. It was systemic. Jessica sat back in her office, the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. She had suspected that something wasn't right, but now, the evidence was staring her in the face. It wasn't just the security guard, Gregory, or the employees who had allowed Malik to be falsely accused. This was a much bigger problem. The way the system operated, where the value of a customer was tied to their spending rather than their dignity, was a flaw that ran through the heart of the company. She started to realize that clearing Malik's name was only the beginning. She had to fix this. But how? The company had been running this way for years. Employees had grown accustomed to it, and changing the culture wouldn't be easy. The roadblocks were immediate. During a follow-up meeting with some of the company's senior leadership, Jessica brought up the idea of implementing a fairer, more inclusive customer service policy. She laid out the statistics from her investigation, showing the clear discrepancies in how employees treated customers based on their socioeconomic status. She argued that these discrepancies were hurting the company's reputation and that it was time for a major change. However, Jessica's ideas were met with resistance. The head of management, a senior leader in the company who had been there for decades, immediately pushed back. "Jessica, I understand your point, but you're talking about changing a system that's worked for years. We can't afford to disrupt things like this. Our profits rely on these high-spending customers," he said, his voice tinged with concern. Jessica felt a surge of frustration. She had expected some pushback, but hearing these words hit her harder than she had anticipated. She had come into this role with the belief that she could make real change. But now, it was clear that some of her colleagues weren't willing to risk the financial stability the company had built up over time. How do you explain the countless customers who feel mistreated, overlooked, or even humiliated? Jessica asked, her voice tight with emotion. Do we just keep ignoring their complaints because it's more profitable to cater to the ones who spend the most? The room grew quiet. The senior leadership team shifted uneasily. Avoiding her gaze, Jessica could feel the pressure mounting. She wasn't just fighting for fairness anymore, she was fighting against a deeply entrenched system. But she wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. As Jessica continued to press for change, she received an anonymous tip from someone within the company's human resources department. A report had been sent to her, outlining the lengths to which certain managers had gone to protect employees who'd been involved in misconduct, such as Gregory's mishandling of Malik's case. The report revealed that the cover-ups weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a larger culture within the company where violations were ignored or even protected, as long as it served the financial interests of the business. Jessica was stunned. What Malik had experienced was just the tip of the iceberg. She now had evidence that suggested the company had been systematically failing to address customer complaints and employee misconduct for years. This was much bigger than Gregory or any single employee. It was a corporate culture issue, one that Jessica was determined to change. As she read through the confidential report, Jessica's mind raced. The company's entire structure, its hiring, training, customer service policies, was built on flawed practices. The truth was now right in front of her, and the fight ahead would be more difficult than she had imagined. But Jessica knew she couldn't back down. She wasn't just going to fight for Malik anymore, she was going to fight for the future of the company, for its employees, and for the customers who deserved better. Jessica stood up from her desk, determined to act on what she had learned. She knew this was going to be a long and difficult road, but it was a road she was prepared to walk. The meeting was set. Jessica knew this would be the turning point. Either the company would begin to turn around, or it would be forced to deal with the consequences of its systemic problems. She had gathered all the key players in one room, the senior management team, Richard Langley included, and a few select others who had been involved in the debacle surrounding Malik's accusation. Richard had always been a figure of influence within the company. As the regional director, his voice carried weight. He had a history of making decisions that benefited certain people, and Jessica was beginning to realize that some of those decisions weren't as innocent as they appeared. She needed to confront him, and the system he had helped build, head-on. The meeting began with Jessica presenting her case. She stood confidently before the group, a presentation filled with evidence, statistics, and reports on how the company's current policies had been damaging to both employees and customers. There were glaring inequalities, biases in how people were treated, and clear signs that the company's leadership had turned a blind eye to those issues for far too long. Today, we have to face the truth. This company has been complicit in a culture of favoritism, where customer treatment is determined by how much they spend, not by how much they deserve to be treated with respect. Jessica began, her voice firm but not angry. She kept her eyes on the room, watching the reactions as they absorbed what she was saying. I've seen the reports, the feedback from the customers, and now I've seen the security footage. It's clear. We need to change our approach. We need new policies, better training, and a more inclusive, ethical environment. I am asking for your support in immediately implementing these changes. As the video from the previous meeting played again, showing the damning evidence against the security guard and the employees who had failed to act ethically, Jessica saw Richard's face tighten. He didn't need to say a word, his body language spoke volumes. Richard was not pleased. I understand your concerns, Jessica. Richard finally spoke, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. But I'm afraid you're asking for too much. Too fast. These changes you're proposing, well, they could cost us, not just in reputation, but in revenue too. If we disrupt things too quickly, we risk losing a large portion of our high-paying customers. Jessica felt a chill run through her. But she didn't flinch. She had been expecting this. Richard wasn't just any regional director. He was the type of leader who saw profits as the ultimate priority. And any challenge to that was a threat to his authority. We can't keep letting these systemic issues slide just because they're profitable. What happens when we lose the trust of the customers who've been mistreated? How long will that last? Jessica countered, her voice rising with the intensity of her words. Richard shifted in his seat, his hands clasped in front of him, as if weighing his options. You don't get it, do you? He said, his voice lowering. What you're asking for is a radical overhaul. We can't afford that. It's not just about the customers we've lost, it's about the ones we still have. We risk everything with these changes. And if you keep pushing this agenda, you won't just lose the support of your colleagues, you'll lose your position as CEO too. The room went dead silent. Jessica's breath caught for a moment, but she quickly steadied herself. Richard's words were a threat, no matter how veiled it seemed. He was trying to intimidate her, to back her down, but this was her company now, and she would not be swayed by threats. She looked at him squarely. You're trying to intimidate me, Richard, but I won't be silenced. If you think I'll back down and let this company continue down this path of unfairness, you're wrong. The air in the room thickened as the rest of the senior leadership team shifted uneasily, sensing the confrontation was far from over. But Jessica wasn't done yet. She had come here for more than just Richard's acquiescence. She was about to pull the rug out from under him. After the meeting, Jessica returned to her office. But her thoughts were still buzzing with frustration. The encounter with Richard had only confirmed what she feared. He wasn't interested in change. But he wasn't the only one who held power in this company. Jessica was about to find out just how deep the rot went. Later that day, she received an anonymous email that would change everything. A report attached to the email outlined how Richard and other top managers had been manipulating company policies for years. The reports showed how certain managers had repeatedly ignored or dismissed complaints, all to maintain a system that benefited the highest-paying clients while disregarding those who mattered just as much, the everyday customers. The report made Jessica's blood run cold. This wasn't just about Gregory's mistake or Malik's false accusation. This was a long-standing issue. Richard wasn't merely defending a flawed system, he was actively maintaining it, ensuring that people who followed the rules were punished, and those who had the means to play the game were rewarded. Jessica slammed her hand down on her desk, her mind racing. This was bigger than she'd thought. Richard and his allies had created a system of favoritism and discrimination that had poisoned the company for far too long. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of her next steps settling over her. Jessica wasn't just fighting for Malik anymore, she was fighting for the soul of the company. The company that had been built on a foundation of exploitation was now at a crossroads. She would have to take down Richard and the system that had propped him up. This battle was just beginning, and Jessica was ready. The discovery of Richard's manipulation within the company had shaken Jessica to her core. But it also fueled her determination. What had started as an effort to clear Malik's name had now expanded into something far more significant, a battle against a deep-seated system of corruption that had been allowed to fester for years. Jessica couldn't back down now. Not only did she need to change the policies, but she also needed to expose the truth behind everything that had happened to Malik and countless others. She was no longer just fighting for one person. She was fighting for the future of the entire company. And for justice. Her first move was to reach out to those within the company who had been forced to remain silent about the injustices they had witnessed. There were whispers, rumors, but Jessica knew she had to rely on those who had lived through the broken system. These were the people who knew the full extent of what was happening. It wouldn't be easy to gain their trust, especially with the risk of retaliation looming over them. But Jessica had made it clear she was ready for the fight. She had already taken on Richard, and now, nothing could stop her from exposing the rot inside the company. She began her investigation quietly, reaching out to employees anonymously, gathering their stories and piece by piece. The puzzle started to take shape. It was worse than she had imagined. Not only were the policies in place unfair, but they were also deliberately designed to favor a select few, while those who followed the rules were punished or ignored. Jessica began to realize that Richard's influence wasn't just limited to the security guard incident. He had built an entire system around him. One that kept employees in line with fear and greed. Slowly, the people who supported Jessica began to emerge from the shadows. Some had been too afraid to speak up, fearing for their jobs and livelihoods. But as more employees came forward, the picture became clearer. These employees had witnessed firsthand the corruption that had been allowed to thrive within the company's ranks. Some had been part of the problem, but others had been victims, too. Silent witnesses to the unethical decisions that had hurt so many. Jessica knew she had to tread carefully. She wasn't just trying to dismantle Richard's empire, she was also trying to protect the very people who had been affected by it. There were lines to be crossed, and she couldn't risk alienating those who might be able to help her. But the more she dug, the more questions arose. How far did this corruption go? Who else in the company was involved? And, perhaps most importantly, how much had been covered up for so long that no one dared to speak out? As Jessica worked to gather more information, the pressure started to build. Richard and his allies within the company had begun to react to her actions, and their opposition grew stronger by the day. They saw Jessica's efforts as a threat to their control, and they weren't going to let her dismantle the system without a fight. It wasn't long before Richard confronted Jessica in a private meeting. His once polite demeanor had shifted to something colder, more calculating. He knew exactly what Jessica was up to, and he wasn't about to let her succeed. "Jessica," Richard said, his voice steady, but with a layer of venom beneath the surface. "You need to stop this. You're going to ruin the company if you keep pushing for these changes. You're risking everything, the reputation, the profits, the entire future of this place." Jessica looked him square in the eye, unflinching. "I'm not going to stop. Not when I know what you've been doing. The company doesn't need to keep operating on a foundation of lies and manipulation. You're only here to protect your own interests." "Richard, this isn't about the company. It's about power." Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the table as if considering his next move. "I don't think you understand the full picture. You push too hard, and you'll see what happens. The board won't support you. They'll side with me, and you'll be out." The threat hung in the air like a heavy fog. But Jessica didn't flinch. She had expected as much. Richard was always going to play dirty, always going to use his influence to keep the status quo. But Jessica wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready to do whatever it took to expose the truth. The conversation ended with Richard storming out, but Jessica remained seated at the table, her thoughts racing. She had known that Richard wouldn't back down without a fight, but she was determined to win this war. She couldn't let him, or anyone else, stop her from changing things for the better. The stakes were too high, and the damage was too deep. As she gathered her notes and prepared to leave the meeting, Jessica received an email from an anonymous source within the company. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the message and saw the attachment. A secret report from HR detailing the extent of Richard's manipulation. It was worse than she could have imagined. The report laid out, in painstaking detail, how Richard had consistently manipulated company policies, not just for personal gain, but for the benefit of his closest allies. The document revealed covert deals with shady partners, financial kickbacks, and other forms of corruption that had been quietly buried for years. Jessica's blood ran cold as she realized just how much of the company's success had been built on lies, unethical decisions, and unchecked power. She quickly read through the report, each line fueling her anger and determination. This wasn't just about fixing a broken system anymore. This was about taking down the very foundation Richard had built and making sure no one else ever had the power to manipulate the company again. Jessica sat back in her chair, her mind working furiously. She wasn't going to let Richard and his allies get away with this. It was time to go public. Time to confront Richard directly with this evidence. To expose everything he had done. And to make sure that the world saw him for who he truly was. The battle was far from over. But now, with this new evidence in her hands, Jessica felt more certain than ever that she would win. She had a plan, and she was ready to make it happen. No one, not Richard, not anyone, was going to stop her from exposing the truth. Jessica sat in the conference room, her mind racing as she prepared for the meeting ahead. This was the moment of truth. She had collected all the evidence, the videos, the emails, the financial records, everything that showed Richard's manipulations and the deep corruption within the company. She had made the decision to expose it all. And today, in front of the entire board, they would have no choice but to face the truth. As the board members filed into the room, Jessica could feel the weight of their gazes. Some of them questioning, others avoiding eye contact. Richard was among them, his expression as cold as ever. He knew this meeting would be a turning point, but he wasn't ready to concede. He still believed he could control the outcome. Jessica didn't waste time. She stood up and began the presentation, first showing the video footage that clearly demonstrated Richard's involvement in manipulating the company's policies. She then displayed a series of financial transactions that were far from legitimate, all designed to line the pockets of those in power. As the evidence unfolded, the room grew tense. The board members exchanged nervous glances, the air thick with realization that they had been complicit in a much larger scheme than they had ever imagined. This, Jessica said, her voice steady, is what you've been allowing to happen. Richard and others in this room have been making decisions that have damaged this company, ruined lives, and undermined everything we stand for. The time for protecting the guilty is over. The board members were stunned into silence. There was no denying what Jessica had presented. The facts were right in front of them. For some, it was a wake-up call. For others, a moment of deep regret. But for Richard, it was nothing short of a challenge to his authority. I won't let this happen. Richard finally spoke, his voice sharp and defensive. You're trying to ruin the company for your own personal gain. Jessica, you're the one causing the damage, not me. Jessica remained composed, meeting his gaze head-on. What damage? The damage you've caused has been ongoing for years. You've been exploiting the company's resources, manipulating customers, and covering up illegal activities. This is about justice, not personal gain. It's about doing what's right, even when it's difficult. Richard's face hardened, and he stood up, his hands clenched at his sides. You think you can just walk in here and change everything? Do you have any idea what this company will face if you push through these reforms? It's too risky. You're jeopardizing everything. Jessica could feel the tension rise in the room as Richard tried to rally the support of the other board members. Using fear to cloud their judgment, he spoke of the company's financial stability, the future of their clients, and the political ties that held them in place. He made threats, veiled and clear, knowing that the position of CEO was at risk. But Jessica was unwavering. I'm not here to protect a system that benefits a few at the expense of many, she said, her voice calm but resolute. This company needs a future built on fairness, transparency, and trust. If we lose those values, we lose everything. Richard's eyes flashed with anger. He was no longer the confident, powerful figure he had once been in these meetings. Now, his desperation was evident. He wasn't just fighting for his position, he was fighting for control over a broken system that had benefited him for far too long. Jessica didn't flinch. And I'll fight for what's right, she said firmly. You're not going to keep hiding behind this facade anymore. The atmosphere in the room grew more charged. The conflict now laid bare. Richard wasn't going to back down without a fight. But neither was Jessica. This was no longer just about policies, it was about exposing the truth. As the meeting dragged on, Jessica began to realize something unsettling. One of the board members, a senior executive who had always been supportive of her vision, was strangely quiet. His name was Thomas, and he had been an ally in her efforts to push for transparency. But now, his silence was conspicuous. When Jessica turned her attention back to the meeting, she noticed Thomas shifting uncomfortably in his chair. It was subtle at first, but as she scanned the room, something clicked. She recalled the way he had been so supportive of Richard during the earlier stages of her investigation. Was it possible that he was involved? Suddenly, a thought crossed her mind, and she couldn't ignore it. She had to act on it. Thomas, Jessica said, her voice cutting through the room. You've been awfully quiet during this meeting. Is there something you'd like to add? Thomas stiffened. His eyes darted nervously to Richard, who gave him a slight nod. Jessica's suspicions were growing. She was beginning to see the threads of manipulation weave through the room. I'm not sure what you mean, Thomas said, his voice shaky. Jessica narrowed her eyes. She had to push harder. You've been part of this system for a long time, haven't you? You've helped Richard cover up things that should have been exposed years ago. The room went silent as Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sweat beaded on his forehead. It didn't take long for Jessica to see through the facade. He had been part of the problem all along, an unwitting accomplice to the corruption that had permeated the company's upper ranks. Thomas stood, his face flushed with guilt and fear. I didn't know it was this bad, he stammered, his voice breaking. I was just doing what I thought was best for the company. No, Jessica said, her tone now stern. You were doing what was best for you. And for Richard. You were part of the cover-up. Part of the system that let this happen. With that, Jessica knew the battle was far from over. Richard wasn't the only one who had to be held accountable. She now had to deal with Thomas and the others who had allowed this corruption to continue unchecked. Richard, Thomas, this ends now. I'm not just firing you. I'm ensuring that every illegal action you took is investigated thoroughly. There will be no more hiding. No more corruption. We will make sure the company moves forward with integrity. The room was still, everyone finally understanding the weight of what Jessica was saying. This was no longer just a battle for policy change. It was a battle for the soul of the company. Jessica stood tall, her resolve as firm as ever. No matter the cost, she was ready for the fight ahead. The weight of the battle Jessica had started to fight had never been heavier. After exposing Richard's manipulation of the company and his unscrupulous dealings, Jessica had garnered support from some unlikely allies within the organization. But not everyone was on her side. There were still key figures within the company who quietly continued to support the old policies that had allowed corruption to fester for far too long. They had always benefited from the system that Richard had put in place. And now that it was being threatened, they were willing to do anything to keep it intact. Jessica's efforts to reform the company were now in full motion. But the fight had escalated. With each new investigation into financial misconduct, more and more of Richard's dealings were exposed, and the truth was becoming harder to hide. But Jessica knew that exposing the corruption wasn't enough. She needed to hold everyone involved accountable, and that meant taking her fight directly to the public. In a bold move, she decided to organize a public hearing to bring the truth about the company's corruption to light. The idea was simple. Lay out all the evidence and force the company's leaders to face the consequences of their actions. It wasn't just about cleaning up the company, it was about restoring its reputation. About showing the public that the leadership would no longer get away with shady deals and unethical conduct. But Jessica wasn't naive. She knew that the hearing wouldn't go smoothly. There would be opposition, and not just from Richard. The board members, many of whom had quietly supported his schemes, would fight back. And some of Jessica's own allies began to waver, uncertain of the fallout this fight would bring. The power struggle inside the company was reaching new heights. During one of the board meetings, Jessica laid out the evidence once again. The financial transactions, the hidden deals, the fraudulent policies that had harmed both customers and employees, it was all there. And it was all damning. Yet, as she presented it, she could feel the resistance rising. The board members were uneasy. Some of them shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Richard, sitting at the far end of the room, had already begun to speak out against Jessica's actions. Jessica, Richard's voice was calm but menacing. You are pushing the company to the edge. These changes, these public hearings, are only going to cause harm. The customers you claim to protect are going to suffer. And this company will lose everything. Jessica refused to back down. The company is already losing everything. Richard, she said firmly, you've built a system that has benefited a select few while harming everyone else. That's not sustainable. It's not just bad for business, it's unethical. As the room fell silent, Jessica could feel the tension building. She wasn't just fighting Richard anymore, she was fighting a deep-rooted system. A system that valued power and money over integrity. The faces of the board members told her everything she needed to know. They were beginning to realize that Jessica wasn't backing down. But that didn't mean they would give up their control without a fight. Richard wasn't done. If you continue with this agenda, you'll regret it. The board won't support you. And I'll make sure of that, he threatened, his eyes flashing with anger. Jessica took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words. But there was no turning back now. I'm not backing down, she replied, her voice resolute. And if you think I'm the only one who's willing to make this fight, you're wrong. She could feel the eyes of the board on her. Some doubtful, some supportive, but all quietly weighing the risks. Jessica knew that there was more at stake than just company policies. There was a larger issue at hand, one that went beyond profits and power. She was fighting for justice. And no matter the opposition, she wouldn't let herself be intimidated. The tension reached a breaking point as Richard continued to press. He knew that his position was on the line. And he wasn't going to give up without a fight. You think the public will back you up? Richard sneered. You're fighting for a cause that's already lost. When they see how this company's been run, they'll want to tear it down. And you'll be the one left holding the pieces. Jessica took a step forward, her gaze never leaving Richard's. Maybe the public won't back me up immediately, she said, her voice cold and calm. But when they see what's been done to them, when they understand that this company has been playing them for years, they'll see who's been lying. The room was tense, with only the faint sound of the air conditioning filling the silence. But just as Jessica thought she had made her point, something unexpected happened. One of Jessica's allies, a senior executive who had been supportive of her reforms, suddenly stood up. His face pale, he looked directly at Richard before slowly turning to Jessica. Jessica, I have to tell you something, he said, his voice shaking. Jessica turned to him, her heart racing. What is it? The executive's face twisted with guilt. I've been involved in helping Richard cover up some of these transactions. I didn't know how bad it was, but I knew enough to keep quiet. The revelation hit like a punch to the gut. Jessica's eyes narrowed as she processed his words. She had trusted him, believed in his support, and now, here he was, betraying her, just like Richard. I'm sorry, the executive said, his voice breaking. I thought I was protecting the company. But now I see that I was part of the problem. I'll do whatever I can to help fix this. Jessica stared at him, a mixture of anger and disbelief in her eyes. She had known that corruption ran deep. But this was a new low. This was not just a problem with Richard, it was a problem with the entire system. And it was going to take more than just firing a few bad apples. It was going to take a complete overhaul. She felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. There was no turning back now. The fight had gotten more dangerous. But Jessica was ready. This wasn't just about exposing Richard, it was about exposing the entire corrupt system he had built. And she wasn't going to stop until it was all brought into the light. Jessica had never felt more cornered in her life. Betrayed by allies and facing the looming collapse of everything she had fought for. She knew this was a turning point. The stakes were higher than ever. And every step forward felt like a battle. Yet, even with the odds stacked against her, she wasn't about to give up. There was too much on the line. Too many lives at stake. She couldn't afford to back down now. If she did, everything she stood for, would have been in vain. Richard's betrayal had cut deep. He had once been a powerful ally, someone she trusted, but now he had turned against her. Along with his allies in the company, Richard had set his sights on maintaining his grip on power. And with his threats of exposure, he had managed to unsettle some of Jessica's most loyal supporters. But Jessica wasn't the type to bow to intimidation. She had been underestimated before, and now it was time to turn the tables. With a renewed sense of purpose, Jessica formulated a new plan, a breakthrough strategy that would allow her to expose Richard's dark dealings once and for all. This time, she wouldn't be working alone. She reached out to trusted legal experts, financial analysts, and even investigative journalists who could help her bring the truth to light. She knew that to take down Richard and his corrupt empire, she would need to do it publicly and with irrefutable evidence. Her plan was set into motion. Jessica decided to call for a public press conference, where she would release all the evidence of Richard's illegal financial transactions, shady business practices, and his ties to political figures who had helped him maintain control over the company. It was a risky move, but Jessica knew it was the only way to force the company's leadership to confront the truth. As the press conference date loomed, the tension inside the company grew. Richard, now fully aware of Jessica's intentions, escalated his efforts to sabotage her. He began to leverage his political and financial connections, attempting to rally the board of directors and the other executives to pressure Jessica into backing down. He even whispered rumors about her motives, suggesting she was only pursuing these reforms for personal gain. But Jessica wasn't fooled. She knew Richard was manipulating the situation to his advantage, trying to tarnish her reputation and derail her plan. The conflict between them was becoming a public spectacle, and Jessica's patience was wearing thin. Every day brought new challenges. The board meetings had become battlegrounds, with Richard and his allies questioning her abilities, her integrity, and even her motives. There were whispers, there were threats, and there were desperate attempts to sway the opinions of the remaining loyalists who still supported her cause. But Jessica wasn't about to back down. She had faced worse. She had been underestimated, pushed to the brink, and yet she had always found a way to rise above it all. This time, she wasn't going to let Richard or anyone else get away with it. She knew the stakes, and she understood the cost of inaction. In one particularly tense meeting with the board, Richard tried again to convince everyone that Jessica's plan was too risky. "This is madness," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're going to destroy the company for what? To satisfy some misguided sense of justice? You think these people are going to back you up? They'll turn on you as soon as the profits start dropping. You'll be the one to blame." "Jessica, not me." Jessica's response was calm but unwavering. "You've been lying to them. Richard, you've been lying to everyone. And now it's time for the truth to come out." Richard's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "You think you can control the narrative? You're playing a dangerous game. If you push this, I will make sure you lose everything, your job, your reputation, everything." The tension in the room was unbearable, but Jessica knew she couldn't afford to let Richard's threats intimidate her. She had worked too hard, fought too long, to let him win. As the meeting ended and the board members filed out, Jessica remained seated, steeling herself for what was coming next. She could feel Richard's eyes on her, and though he didn't say another word, his glare spoke volumes. Later that day, Jessica received an unexpected email. It was from an anonymous source within the company. The message contained a confidential financial report that exposed more than she could have anticipated. Richard hadn't just been manipulating company policies. He had been orchestrating a web of illegal transactions with outside partners, hiding kickbacks, and even funneling money through third parties to avoid detection. The report was a bombshell, detailing years of underhanded dealings that, if exposed, could bring the company to its knees. Jessica read through the document carefully, her heart racing. This was the leverage she needed. With this new information, she could tear down Richard's empire. She wasn't just going to stop at exposing his financial misconduct, she was going to take him down completely. This was bigger than her. This was about saving the company, ensuring that no one could ever manipulate the system again. She immediately began preparing her next move. With the new evidence in hand, she called her legal team to ensure that they could validate the transactions and present them in the most undeniable way possible. She contacted the journalists who had been covering the company's internal struggles, offering them a first look at the evidence. And then, she set the date for the press conference. When the day finally arrived, Jessica stood in front of the cameras. Calm but resolute, she was about to reveal everything Richard had worked so hard to keep hidden. She outlined the evidence, one by one, showing how Richard and his allies had systematically undermined the company's values for years. With every piece of proof she presented, she could see Richard's expression grow darker, his facade cracking in real time. The media coverage was instant. News outlets, social media platforms, and industry experts were all reporting on the revelations. Richard tried to push back, using his connections to discredit Jessica, but it was too late. The truth had already come out. As the dust began to settle, Jessica felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. She had won, but she knew the real work was just beginning. The company needed to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope. Richard was fired, and investigations into his dealings were launched. But Jessica's fight was far from over. She knew that true change would take time, and there would always be those who fought against it. But with the truth on her side, Jessica was ready for whatever came next. The aftermath of the public revelation had been intense. The financial investigations and the illegal transactions uncovered by Jessica had created waves that rippled through every corner of the company. Jessica had anticipated some resistance, but the support she received from both the public and a few employees was stronger than she had expected. The truth was out, and that brought a sense of vindication that, while gratifying, did little to ease the growing pressure she was facing. Despite the overwhelming support from those who believed in her vision, Jessica knew she wasn't out of the woods yet. Richard's web of influence still ran deep, and his allies were far from finished. The threats kept coming, though more veiled now. They weren't just aimed at Jessica's leadership, they were targeted at her reputation. Her very character. The aim was to weaken her position and force her to compromise. She was no longer just battling Richard and his cronies, she was up against a system. A structure that had been in place for years. The board of directors, those who had quietly supported the corrupt practices, now felt threatened by the changes she was pushing. Some members of the board, whose personal ties to Richard were undeniable, began to vocalize their opposition to Jessica's actions. They argued that her revelations had hurt the company's reputation, pointing to the media storm that had erupted in the wake of the public disclosures. "You've put the company in a position it can't recover from," Jessica, one of the senior board members, said during a tense meeting. "We are facing a crisis. Public perception has turned against us, and revenue has already started to decline. These reforms you're proposing are too risky." Jessica remained calm, her eyes scanning the faces of the board members, most of whom were too nervous to meet her gaze. She understood what was at stake: the company's long-term survival, her role as CEO, and the trust that had been broken. But the pressure from Richard's camp, the threats, the manipulation, it had become clear to her that compromising now would mean sacrificing the future of the company. "You're right," Jessica replied, her voice unwavering. "There are risks, but those risks come from a system that's been corrupt for far too long. What's the cost of staying silent? What happens when we continue down this path of secrecy and deceit? I'm not willing to let that happen." The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled in. The internal conflict was visible, with some board members clearly torn, others too afraid to speak up. Jessica had made it clear that her vision for the company involved change, real, lasting change, but not all of them were ready to accept that reality. Meanwhile, Richard, though exposed, wasn't going down without a fight. His earlier attempts to discredit Jessica had failed, but that didn't mean he had stopped trying to shift the focus back onto her. In private conversations with other board members, he continued to push the narrative that Jessica's decisions were harming the company. He accused her of creating an unnecessary crisis, one that had the potential to cause irreparable damage to the business. "You've been used, all of you," Richard would say, playing on their fears. "Jessica's agenda is selfish, and the longer we let her push it, the more we risk. You've all seen the drop in our profits. The customers she's trying to protect, they're not the ones who are keeping this company afloat." Despite his best efforts, Richard's influence was starting to slip. He had underestimated the loyalty of Jessica's allies, those who truly cared about the company's values. The tension continued to grow, but Jessica had one more card to play. As Jessica continued to navigate the complex political landscape of the company, a new piece of the puzzle fell into place. A group of investigative journalists, led by a seasoned financial reporter she had worked with previously, had started their own independent investigation into Richard's financial dealings. What they uncovered was even more damning than Jessica could have imagined. Richard wasn't just guilty of the manipulations she had already exposed. He had been involved in a series of illegal financial transactions that extended beyond the company's borders, with connections to shady business partners and hidden offshore accounts. When the investigative report was published, it sent shockwaves through the business world. The evidence was irrefutable. Richard's schemes had reached far and wide, and the depth of his corruption was laid bare for the world to see. The report detailed how he had been funneling money through various fronts, covering up the company's illegal dealings with the help of high-ranking officials. It was a criminal operation disguised as corporate success. With this new evidence in hand, Jessica knew what she had to do. The time for negotiation was over. She called for another board meeting, where she would make her move. The game had changed. Now, she would make sure that those responsible for the corruption would face the consequences. At the meeting, Jessica didn't waste time. She presented the findings of the independent investigation, making it clear that Richard's actions were not just unethical, they were criminal. She gave the board one last chance to do the right thing: fire Richard and any other executives involved in the illegal transactions. The evidence was overwhelming, and Jessica knew that if they allowed Richard to continue in his role, they would be complicit in his crimes. The board was silent. Some members looked uneasy, while others seemed ready to push back. But Jessica had the leverage now. The public pressure, the media storm, and the undeniable evidence were all on her side. She wasn't going to let Richard or anyone else destroy the company with their greed and deceit. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the board members began to nod. One by one. It wasn't a unanimous decision. Some members were still resistant, but they knew what had to be done. Richard was out. Jessica stood up, her resolve unshaken. "It's over, Richard," she said, her voice firm. "You've lost." Richard, for the first time in the entire ordeal, looked defeated. His posture sagged, and for a moment, his usual bravado crumbled. He tried to speak, to protest, but the evidence was too much. The board had spoken. The battle was won, but the war wasn't over. Jessica had taken down the figurehead of the corruption, but she knew that there was still work to do. The company would need to rebuild from the inside out. It would take time, effort, and dedication, but she was ready for the long road ahead. As she walked out of the meeting room, Jessica couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, knowing that the company was finally on the path to redemption. But deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning of the changes that needed to come. She would not stop until the company was a place where integrity and fairness were valued above all else. Jessica had never expected the aftermath of exposing the company's corruption to feel so heavy. It wasn't just about clearing the air and getting rid of Richard and his accomplices. It was about what came after. The company's entire structure was built on the very foundations of the corruption she had just eradicated. As much as she had succeeded in ridding the company of its most blatant wrongdoers, the deeper issues remained. The culture of exploitation, favoritism, and fear wasn't going to disappear overnight, no matter how many enemies she toppled or how much evidence was exposed. She had barely wiped the sweat off her brow before the next challenge arose. The truth was out, but the job wasn't finished. Jessica had to rebuild from the ground up, starting with the employees who had suffered the most under Richard's regime. These were the people she needed to protect, those who had been silenced, ignored, or taken advantage of. They were the heart of the company. And yet, many of them still looked at her with skepticism. Could she really be trusted? Could she genuinely change things? These questions lingered in their eyes, even if they didn't say it out loud. Jessica had already rolled up her sleeves, planning the reforms that would reshape the company for the better. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The first step was to ensure that employees understood the changes were for the long term. She needed to prove that the company could be both successful and ethical, and that the new system wouldn't just favor those who paid the highest price for their services. There would be new training programs to teach staff about fairness, respect, and customer service. She started holding meetings with departments, gathering feedback, listening to complaints, and creating new systems that prioritized ethics over profits. But even as she worked to rebuild, she could feel the resistance. There were whispers in the hallways. Moments when she caught the cold stares of some of the former high-ranking staff. Richard's allies were still lurking in the shadows, afraid that their perks and control would be stripped away. A few of them tried to quietly sabotage her plans, putting obstacles in her way where they could. They didn't want the changes she was pushing for, not because they didn't agree with the values, but because it would threaten their comfort. They had spent years reaping the rewards of an unjust system, and now, they didn't want to give that up so easily. Jessica felt the weight of it all. She had to balance the need to change with the need to keep the company's operations running smoothly. One wrong move, one misplaced decision, and it could all come crashing down. Every step she took had to be calculated, and even then, there were no guarantees. Some employees were skeptical, some passive-aggressive in their resistance, and some had outright made it clear that they wouldn't support her, no matter how much evidence there was. Still, Jessica pressed on. She organized more meetings, set up training sessions, and, with the help of the employees who believed in her, began to implement systems that ensured fairness at every level. She knew the road would be long, but she wasn't backing down. Not now, not after everything that had been exposed. But the resistance didn't stop there. It came from unexpected places. The very people who had once been loyal to Richard, those who had been complicit in the company's culture of exploitation, began to stir. They saw Jessica as a threat to their comfortable lives, and they would stop at nothing to maintain their grip on power. They would find ways to disrupt her efforts, to undermine her authority, and to manipulate the situation so they could regain their lost influence. One of the most subtle yet damaging moves came from within the ranks of Jessica's own supporters. A trusted senior executive, someone who had been on her side during the hardest parts of the battle, had begun to slip into the old ways. She caught a few hints, a few whispers that hinted he was involved in more than he let on. Jessica's suspicions grew stronger. Was this person truly loyal, or was he playing both sides of the game? Her fears were confirmed during a meeting with him when she asked about some recent decisions he had made. He had been part of the discussions about the new policies, yet his suggestions started to echo the old ways of thinking. He was pushing for compromises, ones that would dilute the effectiveness of her reforms. The more Jessica probed, the more uncomfortable he became. "Why are you backing down on these changes?" she asked him one afternoon. After one too many suggestions that seemed more aligned with Richard's legacy than her own values. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Look, Jessica, I know what you're trying to do, but you have to be careful. There are people in this company who don't want these changes. If you push too hard, we risk everything. This place has a reputation. If we move too fast, we could lose everything we've worked for." Jessica's gaze hardened. "No, what we're doing is the right thing. It's the only way forward." But as she spoke, she knew the situation was more complicated than she had anticipated. Even the people she thought she could trust were getting caught up in the old mindset. This wasn't just a battle with Richard anymore. It was a battle for the very soul of the company. And just as Jessica was beginning to feel the weight of the internal struggle, the news hit. A leak from within the company had spread, undermining the hard work she'd already put in. Richard's allies, still holding power behind the scenes, had found a way to manipulate the narrative. They were fighting back, trying to discredit Jessica and make it seem as though the reforms she had pushed for were the real cause of the company's problems. The media, eager for a sensational story, began running with the narrative that Jessica was damaging the very company she was trying to save. The attacks were personal now. Jessica wasn't just fighting for justice anymore, she was fighting for her own career, her own credibility. Richard and his network were using every trick in the book to turn public opinion against her. The pressure was becoming unbearable, and for a moment, Jessica wondered if she had made a mistake. But then, she remembered what she had come for. The work wasn't done. The company was still hers to rebuild, and no matter how many people tried to tear her down, she would never give up. She would find a way to push through. Jessica realized that change, real and lasting change, was never easy. It would take more than just a few months of hard work to shift a system as entrenched as this. But she couldn't stop now. The work was too important. And so, Jessica pushed on, knowing that the road ahead was long and uncertain. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she was ready for whatever came next. The battle for the future of the company had just begun. And she would be the one to see it through. As we've seen in today's story, sometimes the truth is hidden beneath the surface, and it takes courage to uncover it. Whether it's standing up against unfair treatment or challenging systems that have been in place for far too long. Change begins with those who are willing to question what's wrong and fight for what's right. So, what would you do if you were in the shoes of Jessica or Malik? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters. Before we wrap up, don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths for more eye-opening stories. Your support helps us bring more important topics to light. Thank you for being part of this journey.